So this presentation is going to be on the Meno. The Meno is probably among the top 2 or 3 most assigned dialogues of Plato's. It's probably the Meno, the Apology, and the Republic that most people end up reading. And part of that is because the Meno has a pretty famous passage in it called Meno's Paradox, and a pretty famous theory, the theory of recollection. Really, it has 2 famous theories, but we will get to the other one later. It is also widely read because it's pretty well written. Meno is a fairly well fleshed out character. You get a pretty good sense of what he was like. And the dialogue is structurally complex. We will get to that point in the very next slide. So the Meno is what is sometimes called a transitional dialogue. It is part of the transition from the early dialogues, where Plato seems to be presenting Socrates' views, to the middle period dialogues, where Plato seems to be presenting his own views, distinct views from Socrates'. In between, in the transitional dialogues, Plato engages in critical reflection on Socrates, his central doctrines, and his method. On the surface, this dialogue is about whether virtue can be taught. But what it is really about is whether the Socratic method can actually work. And structurally, this dialogue starts out just like an early dialogue would. In fact, the first third of this dialogue, taken on its own, would function just fine as an early dialogue. This one on whether virtue can be taught. One thing it has in common with the early dialogues is that it, the first third of the Meno, ends without an answer. You might remember that Euthyphro and Socrates don't get to an answer in the dialogue the Euthyphro. They don't know at the end of the dialogue what the definition of piety is. Socrates and his interlocutor end up in a state of puzzlement without an answer. And this is a common occurrence in the early dialogues. Now, in the early dialogues, this state of puzzlement, in Greek aporia, would mark the end of the dialogue. But the Meno is different. In this dialogue, Meno pushes back on Socrates a bit, questioning his method and allowing Plato to explore some deeper ideas about the nature of knowledge and inquiry. Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the character Meno. So Meno was a real person, someone who Plato almost certainly knew, and Meno had a really terrible reputation. A lot of the characters in the dialogues were well known in Plato's time, and usually well known for bad reasons. In Meno's case, he is an unscrupulous mercenary adventurer. You might remember that I said that Socrates also appears, besides in the dialogues of Plato, in the dialogues of a guy named Xenophon. Xenophon was another student of Socrates'. But Xenophon didn't only write in dialogue form and didn't only write philosophy. And in fact, the most famous thing he wrote was neither dialogue nor philosophy. His most famous work was a memoir about how he, Xenophon, led a Greek army out of Persia. The basic situation was that the emperor of Persia had a little brother who wanted to become the king, or emperor. And so the little brother hired a Greek mercenary army to help him overthrow his older brother. The Greek mercenary army was led by this little Persian prince, and there was a big battle in the middle of the Persian Empire, far away from Greece. The Greek army won the battle, but the Persian prince who had hired them died in the fighting. So they were a victorious army whose reason to fight had just died. There weren't any other armies around in their general vicinity after the battle, so these Greeks had a decision to make about what to do. And among the choices they had to make was a choice about who would lead them. There were, according to Xenophon, 2 primary leaders, himself and Meno. And according to Xenophon, Meno was so immoral and dishonest that his being captured and tortured for a year until he died by the Persians was thought to be a good thing by his fellow Greeks. And this is the guy that Plato chooses to have speak to Socrates in a dialogue about virtue. And at certain points, Socrates makes clear that Meno is not a particularly good person, and that Meno has problems with his moral character. Now, to be clear, Meno in this dialogue is being represented as a fairly young man before he grows up to do the terrible things that Xenophon tells us about. But Plato's readers would have known how Meno turned out, and that certainly was part of the reason Plato picked him as a character. All right. So much for the stage setting. Now we get into the reason why I assigned this dialogue. The Meno is really all about inquiry. Inquiry is how you go about getting knowledge, and to know what form inquiry is going to work, you need to know something about knowledge itself and what it is. And these are exactly the topics that get the most attention in this dialogue. Meno opens the discussion with the question, can virtue be taught? Socrates immediately answers that he doesn't know, and in fact that he can't know, since he doesn't know what virtue is. He says, if I do not know what something is, how can I know what qualities it possesses? Now, what is pretty clear from the context here is that Socrates is claiming to not know the definition of virtue. And more generally, he's claiming that if you don't know the definition of something, then you can't know anything about that thing. And you should think about this claim in light of what we know about definitions from the Euthyphro. So to define X, you need 1, necessary and sufficient conditions for X, 2, an internally consistent definition, and 3, a description of the essence of X, to explain what makes X things, X, whatever that is. This is what Plato has Socrates say he doesn't know when it comes to virtue, or really anything else. Right? Remember, Socrates denies all knowledge in the Apology, or at least all scientific knowledge. Knowledge that would allow him to explain why things are the way they are. Why true claims are true. Well, Socrates is expressing that same ignorance here. So you can see how the dialogues tie together. The Apology gives us an idea of what kind of knowledge Socrates thought he lacked. The Euthyphro gives us an idea of what having that kind of knowledge requires, what it would take to have a good definition. And the Meno starts out by saying that if you don't have knowledge of definitions, then you don't really know anything else about anything. This principle is called the priority of definition. It says, if you do not know the definition of X, then you can know nothing about X. This is a principle that Plato has Socrates say he accepts over and over again in the early dialogues. And Plato is going to explore the consequences of that principle in the dialogue, the Meno, because it turns out the consequences of that principle are pretty interesting. So like I said, this principle is implicit in the early dialogues. You'll have to take my word for that, because I've read all the early dialogues, and you have read only the Euthyphro and the Apology. But it is a principle that the historical Socrates seemed to accept. And it is one of Plato's intellectual inheritances from Socrates. Once Plato started writing on his own, he kept Socrates' key principles and tried to defend them. And that includes the priority of definition. Now, the priority of definition principle suggests an understanding of knowledge that has some similarities to one of the great achievements, intellectual achievements, of the ancient Greeks, and that is geometry. Now, the roots of geometry go back thousands of years before Plato, before the ancient Greeks were a literate society, all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. However, when you think of geometry, and when people are taught geometry for the first time, they are almost always thinking of or being taught what is called Euclidean geometry. It is called that because it's geometry that's based off a book called The Elements, written by Euclid, a Greek author who lived not terribly long after Plato. Definitely he was born after Plato, lived after Plato died, but not too long after. Euclid's Elements was the standard textbook for geometry in the Western world for over 2,000 years. It wasn't all that long ago. People were still being taught geometry from Euclid. Now, the thing to know about Euclid is that he probably didn't come up with all the math, or maybe even any of the math, in his book. Euclid's function was to bring together geometrical knowledge from lots of different sources and put that knowledge all in one place. It is a textbook, and like all textbooks, the author didn't come up with all the discoveries and all the knowledge contained in the book. One of the sources for Euclidean geometry is, in a roundabout way, Plato himself. Plato founded the first university in world history called the Academy, and he made a central focus of the school the study of mathematics. And one of Plato's star pupils in the study of mathematics was a guy named Eudoxus. And we'll actually run into Eudoxus again when we talk about Galileo later in the semester. Well, Book 5 of Euclid's Elements is just Eudoxus's work. So the thing to realize is that Plato isn't following Euclidean geometry here. Euclid hadn't even been born yet, probably, when the Meno was written. What Plato does do, however, is subscribe to a way of thinking about knowledge that is familiar to us from Euclidean geometry. Because you might remember from geometry class that when you proved things, this is usually most people's least favorite part of geometry, though it was my favorite part of geometry. When you proved things in geometry class, you started out with definitions. For example, the first definition I was taught in geometry class was the definition of a point. What is a point? It is a location in space, in three-dimensional space. It has neither length, width, nor depth. What is a line? It is a collection of points going on forever in two directions. What is a ray? A bunch of points going on forever in one direction. What is a line segment? A finite collection of points. You started out with the definitions, and you began to prove things from those definitions. That's how Euclid's Elements works. The first book of the Elements is just a bunch of definitions. Now, they aren't only called definitions. There are definitions, axioms, postulates, and common notions. But they would all pretty much count as definitions to Plato. And the whole idea of Euclidean geometry is that all the truths of geometry can be derived from those initial set of definitions, axioms, and so on. What Plato is getting from Socrates is basically the same idea, that knowledge had its source in derivations from definitions. In Euclid, you started out with the definitions of simple geometrical objects and derived facts about the more complex objects of geometry by using the definitions you had of their parts. For example, you would prove things about triangles on the basis of things you knew about the definitions of lines. Similarly, Plato thinks all knowledge starts with definitions. This is what he has Socrates say when he asserts the priority of definition, to tell Meno why he can't tell him whether virtue can be taught. So, like I said, the first third of this dialogue is a lot like an early dialogue. Socrates is talking to someone who thinks they know what they're talking about. They try to answer Socrates' questions, they fail, and nothing really goes anywhere. So after Socrates says that he can't tell Meno, that he can't say whether virtue can be taught because he doesn't know what virtue is, Meno basically says, oh, that's all right, I know what virtue is, and I'll tell you what virtue is. And then Meno goes on to fail in many of the same ways that Euthyphro failed. So for one thing, Meno starts out just the way Euthyphro did, by giving examples or a list of virtues instead of defining virtue. Socrates has to tell him that he needs to know what all the virtues have in common, not what different virtues there are for different kinds of people. In his second answer, Meno manages to give a definition, though not a good one. He says that virtue is the ability to rule over others. Now, Socrates' first response is to ask whether a woman or a child is virtuous if they rule over other people. The assumption is that it's absurd to think that a woman or a child could rule over anyone. You might notice the sexism here, and you should notice the sexism here because this is quite sexist. And this might surprise some people since Plato is sometimes given credit for being a kind of early feminist, but he just wasn't. What is true is that Plato had more egalitarian views about women and their capabilities than other Greeks at the time. But because of how shockingly misogynistic Greek culture was at the time, that does not make him a feminist. And by the way, Greek culture was remarkably misogynistic, not just relative to societies today, but even relative to other ancient cultures. The Romans, the Persians, the Egyptians, all of them allowed women more freedom and a greater role in public life than the Greeks did. And the fact that Plato was actually open to the idea of women having political power does not mean that he was just a little more egalitarian than his fellow Greeks, but significantly more egalitarian. However, he thought women, on average, were intellectually inferior to men, and that's just not feminism. All right, that might then make you wonder, why is he treating it as absurd for women to rule? If you've read any other Plato, you might have read in the Republic where he says women can rule the city. Now, the reason is that Meno thinks women ruling is absurd. What Plato is having Socrates do is investigate Meno's belief system. Meno has made a claim that virtue is the ability to rule over others, and Socrates is showing that his claim conflicts with other things Meno believes, namely that women shouldn't rule over others and that women can be virtuous. So Socrates has shown Meno that he has a contradictory belief system. This is what the Socratic method is all about, identifying inconsistencies in the belief system of your interlocutor, the person you're talking to, and forcing them to pick which belief to keep and which belief to abandon. When faced with the contradiction, Meno decides to give up his definition of virtue. He could, of course, have given up his sexist assumption that women shouldn't ever rule, but he didn't. Socrates has a second response to Meno's claim that virtue is the ability to rule, though. Socrates asks, is virtue the ability to rule justly, or the ability to rule unjustly or justly? Meno pretends to not understand, or maybe he actually doesn't understand. This might be a case of Plato subtly expressing the idea that Meno is such a bad person that he doesn't understand the difference between ruling justly and ruling unjustly. And that starts a long tangent, a really interesting tangent, I think, about the definition of color and shape. Plato has Socrates say a lot of things here that intrigue scholars because some of it's really weird. But for the purposes of this class, I think we just need to skip it. We don't need to talk about the color and the shape, even though that was a pretty cool album from the Foo Fighters back in the 90s. So Meno tries again. He gives a third answer. He says that to have virtue is to find joy in beautiful things and have power. Now you might think that this was a bad definition because it consists of two seemingly unrelated clauses. But that's not how Socrates attacks it. The first thing Socrates says is that finding joy in beautiful things is just part of wanting beautiful things. You experience joy when you get what you want, so you take joy in beautiful things when you get them. But, Socrates says, everybody wants beautiful things. Or rather, Socrates says that everyone wants good things. This is something we won't get into much because it's part of Plato's ethics rather than Plato's epistemology, or the study of knowledge. So we aren't going to get deep into the fact that Socrates had this fairly weird view that no one ever wants bad things. Or to put it another way, people only want bad things because they don't know that they are bad. Or to put it yet another way, people are only evil out of ignorance of what is good. No one knowingly chooses to do bad things or have bad things. It is a really interesting view, and there's another transitional dialogue called the Protagoras in which Plato explores that principle and problems with it. Eventually, Plato would abandon the view that no one does evil things on purpose. But we're not going to focus on it. We're not going to get into it. We'll put it to one side. Because Meno agrees that everyone wants what is good and beautiful. So that means the difference between virtuous people and vicious people, according to Meno's definition, is just having the power to get beautiful things. And this sounds a lot like his previous definition. So Socrates asks the same question again. Does Meno mean having power justly or unjustly? Having power wisely or unwisely? Having power and using it moderately or immoderately? Meno at this point gives in and says that virtue is having power and using it in a just, wise, moderate, pious, etc. way. But that just means that virtue is having power and using it virtuously. And so Socrates points out that this isn't a good definition. All that Meno has done is provided examples of virtue again. Wisdom, justice, moderation, etc. They're all virtues. So Socrates says this answer is no good either. Now, another problem is that Meno has defined a moral term virtue using other moral terms. This isn't a problem Socrates identifies, but this is a legitimate problem with the definition. The problem with this is that if you were to go on to define those moral terms, like justice, you would need to likely make reference to the fact that they are virtues. For example, you might define justice as the virtue that concerns rendering on to others what they're owed. But if you use the word virtue to define justice and use the word justice to define virtue, then it's very likely that you've ended up with a circular pair of definitions, which is of no help. At this point, Meno loses his temper. And if this were like the early dialogues that Plato wrote, at this point, Meno would, having lost his temper, storm off in a huff. But Plato does something a little different here. He doesn't just have Meno get angry and storm off. Rather, he has Meno get angry and start insulting Socrates. Meno compares Socrates to the torpedo fish, which is basically like an electric ray that stuns a fish before it eats the fish. Meno compares Socrates to a torpedo fish because, he says, Socrates makes people numb. Meno says that he has often given speeches about virtue and felt like he knew what he was talking about. But now, after having spoken about virtue with Socrates, Meno no longer feels like he knows. And he blames Socrates for this, for making him kind of intellectually numb. Now, if Meno had just stormed off here, it would have been perfectly fine, but forgettable early Platonic dialogue, and no one would read the Meno anymore. There are around 30 Platonic dialogues, and only Plato scholars read them all. But, like I said, this is not where things end. It doesn't just end with Meno insulting Socrates. Plato takes this moment, and he turns it into something a lot more interesting, which is why pretty much everyone who has ever taken a class in Plato has read the Meno.